cold stone walls of the royal palace loomed before Lyanna Frost, like the jaws of some ancient beast, ready to swallow her whole. She stood among 20 other young women, all trembling in their thin ceremonial gowns, waiting to be presented as part of the annual tribute to Alpha King Theron Blackstone. The tradition had existed for as long as anyone could remember, a dark ritual where Omegas and lower-ranking wolves were brought before the cursed king, though none ever truly understood why. Most believed it was to appease whatever darkness lived within him, to prevent the monster from fully emerging and destroying the kingdom. Lyanna clutched her hands together, trying to still their shaking as the massive iron gates groaned open, revealing a courtyard shrouded in perpetual twilight despite the afternoon sun blazing overhead. If you are enjoying this journey into the mysterious world of the Alpha King, please consider leaving a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means everything and helps us bring more stories like this to life. The palace attendants, their faces carefully blank masks of trained indifference, gestured for the group to follow. They moved through corridors that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, past tapestries depicting battles long forgotten and portraits of previous royalty, whose eyes had been deliberately scratched out. Whispers echoed through the halls, though Lyanna could never quite make out the words, as if the very stones remembered conversations from centuries past and replayed them endlessly. She noticed how the servants averted their gazes when passing certain doorways, how they quickened their pace near particular staircases, how they made strange warding gestures when shadows moved in ways that defied the placement of torches. This was a palace built on fear, maintained by terror, and ruled by a king whom even his own people could barely stand to acknowledge existed. They were brought to a vast throne room where darkness seemed to pool in the corners like living liquid. The throne itself was carved from obsidian, its surface reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. And there, slouched in that seat of power with the weariness of someone who had lived far too long, sat Alpha King Theron Blackstone. Even from a distance, Lyanna could feel the weight of his presence, a pressure in the air that made breathing difficult. He was massive, his frame suggesting strength that could tear, steel. Yet there was something wrong about him, something that made instinct scream to run. His skin seemed to shift between flesh and shadow, never quite settling on one state. His eyes, when they opened to regard the trembling tributes, glowed with an eerie silver light that held no warmth, only an ancient, terrible hunger that threatened to consume everything it touched. The palace chancellor, a thin man named Corvus, with a voice like grinding stones, stepped forward to present each woman in turn. Most could barely whisper their names before backing away, unable to withstand the intensity of the king's gaze. Some fainted outright when those silver eyes fell upon them, their wolves whimpering in submission to an alpha power that transcended normal pack hierarchy. When Lyanna's turn came, she forced herself to step forward, even though every fiber of her being screamed to flee. She met those terrible eyes and saw something that made her heart clench, not with fear, but with unexpected sorrow. Behind the monstrous glow, behind the shadows that writhed beneath his skin, she glimpsed profound loneliness, an isolation so complete it seemed to have carved out his very soul and left nothing but aching emptiness. The king's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the barest flicker of surprise crossing his features before the mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. He waved a dismissive hand, and Corvus quickly ushered the tributes away to their assigned quarters in the palace's east wing. As they walked, Lyanna heard the other women whispering frantically about what they had witnessed, about the rumors of the curse that had plagued the Alpha King for over 2 centuries, turning him slowly into something neither fully wolf nor fully man, but a creature of pure shadow and rage. Some said he had been cursed by a witch he had scorned. Others claimed it was punishment from the moon goddess herself for some unforgivable sin. All agreed that he was beyond salvation, beyond redemption, beyond anything resembling hope. That first night in the palace, Lyanna could not sleep. The room they had given her was luxurious beyond anything she had ever experienced in her small village, with silk sheets and velvet curtains and a fireplace that burned with flames that gave off no smoke. Yet comfort could not ease the weight pressing on her chest, the sense that something fundamental was wrong within these walls. Around midnight, she heard it, a sound that froze the blood in her veins. A roar of such anguish and fury that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace, followed by the sound of stone cracking and metal being torn apart. The other tributes huddled in their rooms, covering their ears and praying to the moon goddess for protection. But Lyanna found herself drawn to that sound, compelled by something she could not name. She slipped from her room and followed the echoes of destruction through the dark corridors, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. The servants she passed looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, but made no move to stop her, as if they had learned long ago that interfering with the events of curse nights only brought more suffering. She climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever, ascending into the oldest part of the palace, where the air itself felt heavy with ancient magic and older pain. At the top, she found a door hanging off its hinges, and beyond it, a room that had been utterly destroyed. Furniture lay in splinters, tapestries hung in shreds, and in the center of the devastation knelt Alpha King Theron, his body convulsing as shadows poured from his skin like smoke from a fire. His human form was struggling against something trying to emerge from within, something massive and monstrous that wanted to tear free of the flesh that contained it. His hands had transformed into claws that dug furrows in the stone floor, and his spine arched at an angle that should have been impossible, vertebrae pushing against skin that rippled with darkness. The curse was consuming him, pulling him deeper into an abyss from which there would be no return. Everyone else would have fled. Anyone with sense would have understood the danger and retreated to safety. But Lyanna saw beyond the monster, saw the man trapped inside his own personal hell, fighting a battle he had been losing for centuries. She saw the fear in those silver eyes, not fear of death, but fear of losing the last shreds of his humanity, of becoming the very nightmare that haunted his kingdom's collective imagination. And in that moment, moved by compassion that defied all logic and reason, Lyanna did something that would change the fate of the entire realm. She stepped forward, crossed the space between them, and wrapped her arms around the Alpha King in a tight embrace. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The shadows recoiled as if burned, retreating back beneath his skin. The convulsions stopped. His breathing steadied, and slowly, painfully, his body began to return to its human form. Theron's clawed hands transformed back into human fingers that gripped her arms, not to push her away, but to anchor himself to her presence, to the first genuine comfort he had felt in longer than he could remember. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. Her small frame pressed against his massive one, her heart beating steady and strong where his had been, racing with panic and fury. When he finally pulled back enough to look at her face, his silver eyes were no longer glowing with monstrous hunger, but with confusion and something that might have been wonder. Before either could speak, footsteps thundered up the stairs and palace guards burst into the room, followed by Chancellor Corvus and the King's Beta, Marcus Ironhide. They stopped short at the scene before them, shock evident on every face. No one had ever witnessed the curse being halted. Mid-transformation, no one had ever seen the King's shadows retreat, and certainly no one had ever dared to touch him during one of his episodes. Corvus recovered first, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something calculating and cold. He ordered the guards to escort Lyanna back to her quarters immediately. But Theron's voice, rough from screaming but carrying unmistakable authority, commanded them to leave her be. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next chapter of this incredible story. We have so much more to share about Lyanna and Theron's journey, and your subscription helps us continue creating content you love. The days that followed were strange and tense. Lyanna was moved from the East Wing to rooms closer to the King's private chambers, a move that scandalized the court and set tongues wagging with speculation. She was not imprisoned, but neither was she free to leave, existing in a strange limbo where she was both guest and captive. Theron began summoning her to his study each evening, at first simply having her sit in silence while he worked through mountains of correspondence and reports that governing a kingdom required. He did not explain why her presence seemed to ease the constant pressure of the curse, did not acknowledge the way shadows no longer writhed quite so violently beneath his skin when she was near. He simply seemed to need her there, a living anchor to humanity that he had been without for so terribly long. Gradually, silence gave way to conversation. Lyanna learned that Theron had not always been the monster the kingdom feared. 200 years ago, he had been a young king full of idealism and hope, determined to unite the fractured wolf packs under a banner of peace and prosperity. His downfall had come when he refused the romantic advances of Morgana Nightshade, a powerful witch who served as one of his advisors. Scorned and humiliated, before the court, she had woven a curse of exquisite cruelty, one that would slowly strip away his humanity over centuries, ensuring that he would watch himself become the very thing he despised while remaining conscious and aware throughout the entire transformation. The curse fed on negative emotions, on anger and fear and loneliness, growing stronger with each passing year, until the man would be completely consumed by the monster. Theron had tried everything to break the curse. He had consulted with the most powerful healers, the wisest shamans, the most learned scholars of ancient magic. None could undo what Morgana had done, though they all agreed on the theoretical solution. The curse could only be broken by true love, by someone who could look upon him at his absolute worst, at the peak of his monstrous transformation, and choose to love him anyway. But who could love a monster? Who could see past the shadows and the rage to the man trapped within? For 2 centuries he had given up hope, resigned himself to eventually losing the battle and becoming a mindless creature of destruction that would have to be put down like a rabid animal, until Lyanna had embraced him. The revelation of this potential cure did not escape Chancellor Corvus's attention. In the shadows of the court, he began to weave plots of his own. For decades, he had been the true power behind the throne, making decisions in the king's name while Theron grew increasingly isolated and unstable. If the curse were to be broken, if the king were to truly return to his full power and clarity of mind, Corvus would lose everything he had carefully built. He began spreading rumors about Lyanna, suggesting she was a witch herself, sent to manipulate the king for unknown purposes. He poisoned the minds of nobles against her, painting her compassion as calculated seduction, her kindness as sinister strategy. But within the growing conspiracy around them, something genuine was blossoming between Lyanna and Theron. She told him about her life in the small village, about losing her parents to a rogue attack when she was young, about being raised by the pack's elder who taught her that strength was not about power, but about the courage to show kindness in a cruel world. He shared memories from before the curse, from a time when he had believed that leadership meant service, when he had walked among his people instead of hiding from them in a palace that had become more prison than home. They discovered shared loves of old poetry and constellation mapping, of debates about philosophy and discussions about what made a life worth living. The first time Theron laughed at something Lyanna said, a genuine laugh free from bitterness and pain. The shadows beneath his skin flickered and faded almost to nothing. The servants who witnessed it spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones, as if they had witnessed a miracle, and perhaps they had. With each moment of connection, each instance of genuine emotion that was not anger or despair, the curse weakened its grip. Theron began to look more human, his skin maintaining its natural tone for longer periods, his eyes showing their original deep amber color more frequently than the cursed silver glow. Hope, that dangerous and precious thing, began to take root in his heart for the first time in 2 centuries. But hope makes one vulnerable, and Corvus knew how to exploit vulnerability. He arranged for a visiting Pack Alpha to challenge Theron's authority, knowing that rage and the subsequent transformation would undo months of progress. During the confrontation, Theron felt the curse surge, felt the monster trying to claw its way free, felt his control beginning to slip. The visiting Alpha, a brute named Ragnar Bloodfang, deliberately insulted not just Theron but Lyanna as well, calling her a whore playing at being queen, suggesting she spread her legs for the monster in exchange for palace luxuries. The calculated cruelty of the words hit their mark. and Theron's vision went red with fury. The transformation began, violent and swift. Shadows exploded from his body, his bones cracked and reformed, his humanity drowning beneath a tidal wave of bestial rage. The court scattered in terror. Guards drew their weapons, though they knew such things were useless against the cursed king. And Ragnar himself began to back away, as he realized he had pushed too far. But before the monster could fully emerge, before the last vestiges of Theron's consciousness could be swept away, Lyanna was there. She placed herself between Theron and Ragnar, her small body utterly inadequate as a shield, but her courage absolute and unshakable. She reached up to cup Theron's face, now partially transformed and monstrous, and spoke words that cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. She told him she saw him, truly saw him, and that what she saw was not a monster, but a man who had endured unimaginable suffering, and yet still fought to hold on to his humanity. She told him she was not afraid, that she chose to stand with him, that he was not alone in his battle anymore. And then, with the entire court watching in stunned silence, she stood on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his twisted, monstrous mouth. The shadows shattered like glass, exploding outward in a shockwave that knocked everyone but Lyanna to the ground. When the darkness cleared, Theron stood fully human, his body free from the curses visible. Marks. His eyes their natural amber for the first time in 200 years. He collapsed into Lyanna's arms, and she held him as he wept. Centuries of pain and loneliness finally finding release. The court erupted into chaos. Some hailed it as a miracle. Others called it witchcraft, and Corvus saw his carefully constructed power crumbling before his eyes. He retreated to his chambers and began sending urgent messages to allies throughout the kingdom, calling in debts and activating networks of spies and assassins that he had cultivated over decades. If the curse could not keep the king weak, then more direct measures would be necessary. That night, as the palace celebrated what seemed to be the breaking of the curse, poison was slipped into Lyanna's wine, and blades were sharpened in dark corners of the servants' quarters. The assassination attempt came at dawn. Lyanna woke to find her room filled with smoke and masked figures advancing with weapons drawn. She fought as she had been, taught by the village warriors, managing to disarm one attacker and wound another before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. They dragged her toward the window, clearly intending to stage her death as a suicide or accident, but they had underestimated the bond that had formed between Lyanna and Theron, a connection that went beyond the merely physical or emotional into something almost supernatural. The moment her life was threatened, Theron felt it like a knife to his own heart. He burst into the room with Marcus at his side, his alpha power fully unleashed in ways he had not been capable of while the curse had suppressed his true nature. The fight was brutal and swift. Theron moved like vengeance incarnate, his speed and strength unmatched even among alpha wolves. He tore through the assassins with surgical precision, each strike calculated to incapacitate or kill without hesitation. When the last attacker fell, he pulled Lyanna into his arms, checking her for injuries with hands that trembled despite their strength. She was bruised and shaken but alive, and the relief that flooded through him was so intense it brought him to his knees. He realized in that moment that what he felt for her went far beyond gratitude for breaking his curse, beyond companionship, or even the deep friendship they had developed. He loved her, completely and irrevocably, with an intensity that terrified him, because it made him vulnerable in ways even the curse never had. The investigation into the assassination attempt led directly to Corvus. Documents were found detailing years of embezzlement, of secret alliances with enemy pacts, of plans to eventually overthrow Theron entirely and install a puppet king who would serve Corvus's interests. When confronted, the Chancellor dropped all pretense of loyalty and revealed the depth of his treachery. He had been the one to encourage Morgana's initial interest in the king, feeding her false information about Theron's supposed attraction to her in hopes that her inevitable rejection would create conflict he could exploit. When she had cursed the king instead, Corvus had seen opportunity in catastrophe, helping to isolate Theron from his supporters ensuring that no one who might actually help break the curse ever got close enough to try. The revelation shook the entire court. How many decisions over the past 2 centuries had been Corvus's rather than the king's? How much suffering could have been avoided if the Chancellor's treachery had been discovered sooner? Theron had him imprisoned to await trial, though many called for immediate execution. But Lyanna counseled mercy tempered with justice, reminding Theron that how he handled this moment would set the tone for his renewed reign. He listened to her wisdom and ordered a full accounting of Corvus's crimes, promising that justice would be served, but through proper channels and with full transparency. The court saw in this a king who had returned not just to power, but to the ideals that had once made him beloved before the curse had twisted everything. Yet even with Corvus imprisoned and the immediate threat neutralized, something was not right. The curse had been weakened, pushed back, but not entirely broken. Theron could feel it lurking in the depths of his being, waiting for moments of weakness to reassert itself. The shadows no longer consumed him, but they whispered in the darkest hours of night, promising that one day they would return in full force. Ancient texts were consulted, and a disturbing truth emerged. The curse could only be fully broken by a willing sacrifice of true love, by someone choosing to take the darkness into themselves to free him completely. The ritual would transfer the curse from Theron to another, and given its power and malevolence, the recipient would likely not survive the transfer. When Lyanna learned this, she knew immediately what she had to do. She had seen what the curse had done to Theron over 2 centuries, had witnessed the daily battle he fought against his own darkness, and she refused to let him continue suffering when she had the power to end it. She began researching the ritual in secret, consulting with the few magical practitioners in the court who could be trusted, preparing herself for what she knew would be a one-way journey. Theron must never know her plan, because he would never allow her to sacrifice herself for him. His love for her had become the center of his universe, and losing her would destroy him more thoroughly than the curse ever had. The night Lyanna chose for the ritual was one of the new moon, when darkness held its greatest power, and magic flowed most freely through the world. She slipped from her chambers and made her way to the palace's oldest wing, to a room where Morgana had first cast her curse 200 years prior. The stone walls still bore scorch marks from that dark magic, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with residual malevolence. Lyanna set out the necessary components: candles made from rendered shadow wolf fat, salt mixed with tears of the cursed, and at the center, a blade forged from meteorite iron that could cut spiritual bonds as easily as physical flesh. She began the incantation, words in a language older than the wolf packs, older perhaps than the moon goddess herself. Power began to gather, pulling at the curse that lay coiled around Theron's soul. She felt the moment it became aware of her, felt its attention shift like the gaze of some vast and terrible predator. Pain unlike anything she had ever experienced lanced through her body as the curse began to transfer, shadow and malevolence pouring from Theron into her. Every cell screamed in agony, every nerve alight with suffering that transcended the merely physical. She collapsed to her knees, but forced herself to continue the ritual, each word harder to speak than the last, as her vocal cords began to tear from the strain. Theron woke from sleep with a gasp, feeling the curse being ripped away like a bandage torn from a wound. He knew instantly what was happening and who was responsible. Terror gave him speed as he raced through the palace, following the pull of his bond with Lyanna to the cursed wing. He burst through the door to find her in the center of the ritual circle, her body racked with convulsions as shadows poured into her from seemingly nowhere. Her eyes had taken on that terrible silver glow he knew so well, her skin rippling, as the curse sought to reshape her into a vessel for its malevolence. He screamed her name and tried to enter the circle, but the magical barrier threw him back with enough force to crack the stone wall behind him. Marcus and several guards arrived, along with the few magical practitioners Lyanna had consulted who had realized too late what she intended. They explained that interrupting the ritual now would destroy both Lyanna and Theron, that the curse needed to fully transfer, or it would rebound and consume them both in an explosion of dark magic that would likely level half the palace. Theron could only watch in helpless horror as the woman he loved suffered to free him from his torment. Every instinct screamed to save her, to take the curse back upon himself, to do anything other than stand uselessly while she sacrificed herself. When she looked at him through eyes more silver than human, she smiled despite the agony etched into every line of her face. And he understood that she did this not out of duty or obligation, but out of love. The ritual reached its crescendo, power peaking to levels that made reality itself seem to bend and warp. The curse completed its transfer, settling into Lyanna with a finality that felt like a death knell. The barriers fell, and Theron rushed forward to catch her as she collapsed, her body cold and lifeless in his arms. The shadows beneath her skin writhed victoriously, already beginning the same slow consumption that had taken him 2 centuries. She had saved him, but condemned herself to the exact fate from which she had freed him. The injustice of it, the profound wrongness, threatened to break something fundamental in Theron's mind. He had been freed from his curse only to receive a worse one, doomed to watch the woman he loved suffer as he once had. But as he held her, his tears falling onto her face, something unexpected began to happen. The alpha power that had been suppressed by his curse for 200 years was fully his again, and with it came abilities he had forgotten he possessed. Among the Alpha King's most sacred gifts was the ability to share burdens with his pack, to take suffering upon himself to spare those under his protection. It was a power that worked both ways, allowing the pack to support their alpha in times of need. What if, instead of one person bearing the curse, it could be distributed among many? What if the curse that was too powerful for any one individual to survive could be diluted across hundreds or thousands? Theron reached out through the alpha bonds he had allowed to atrophy during his cursed isolation, bonds connecting him to every wolf in his kingdom. He made no demands, issued no commands, simply opened himself and allowed his people to feel what he felt, to understand what had happened and what was at stake. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From every corner of the realm, wolves young and old, Omega and Alpha alike, reached back through the bond and offered themselves. They had lived for 2 centuries in fear of their king, but they had also benefited from his sacrifice, from his choice to isolate himself rather than risk harming his people. Now they chose to repay that debt. The curse, already confused by Lyanna's interference and partial integration into her being, found itself suddenly divided. Instead of one soul to corrupt, it faced thousands, each taking the tiniest fraction of darkness into themselves, spreading the malevolence so thin that it became manageable. Shadows flickered across the kingdom as every wolf aged enough to withstand the burden accepted their share. Children were protected by parents who took double portions. Elders who had lived long lives volunteered to carry more than their fair share, and alphas throughout the realm bore the heaviest loads. The curse, designed to consume one person completely, found itself unable to destroy thousands simultaneously. It weakened, diluted beyond its ability to maintain cohesion, and finally shattered entirely, dissolving into harmless wisps that faded into the ether. Lyanna gasped back to life in Theron's arms, the silver draining from her eyes as color returned to her skin. The ordeal had left her weak but alive, truly alive, free from the curse that had briefly claimed her. Around the kingdom, wolves collapsed in exhaustion, but none had been consumed. None had been destroyed. They had stood together as a pack in ways they had not for centuries, and, in doing so, had accomplished what no individual ever could have. The curse of Morgana Nightshade, woven with hatred and malice, had been broken not by grand magic or legendary heroes, but by the collective choice of ordinary people to share a burden too great for any one person to bear. The weeks that followed were ones of healing and rebuilding. Corvus was tried and found guilty of countless crimes, his sentence exiled to the lawless lands beyond the kingdom's borders, where he would have to survive on his own merits rather than political manipulation. The corrupt nobles who had supported him were removed from their positions and replaced with individuals chosen for competence and integrity rather than family connections. Theron threw himself into the work of truly ruling again, implementing reforms he had dreamed of 2 centuries ago, before the curse had derailed everything. And through it all, Lyanna remained at his side, not as a rescued Omega, or even as the woman who had broken his curse, but as his equal partner in every sense. Their bond, forged in such extraordinary circumstances and tested by trials that would have destroyed lesser connections, had evolved into something that transcended normal mate bonds. They could feel each other's emotions, sense when the other was in distress, and their very souls seemed to resonate in harmony. The palace, once a place of darkness and fear, slowly transformed into a center of culture and learning. The servants no longer averted their eyes when passing the king. The nobles no longer whispered behind his back. And for the first time in living memory, the royal palace hosted festivals and celebrations open to common wolves from across the realm. 6 months after the curse was broken, Theron proposed to Lyanna not with grand ceremony, but in the quiet of his study where they had first begun to know each other. He offered her not just his love, but his kingdom, asking her to be his queen and rule beside him as his equal. She accepted with tears of joy, and their wedding became the most anticipated event in 2 centuries. Wolves traveled from the farthest reaches of the kingdom to attend, many bringing their children so they could witness history and tell their grandchildren about the day their king married the woman who had saved them all. The ceremony was held under the full moon, the moon goddess herself seeming to bless the union, as her light bathed the couple in silver radiance. When Theron kissed his bride, the entire kingdom felt it through the alpha bonds, a surge of pure joy and love that washed away the last lingering shadows of the cursed years. The celebration lasted for 3 days, with food and drink flowing freely, music and dancing filling the streets, and a sense of hope permeating everything. This was not just a royal wedding, but a rebirth of the kingdom itself, a turning point where fear gave way to faith and isolation gave way to unity. Thank you so much for watching this epic tale of curse-breaking love and redemption. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. Leave a comment sharing your favorite moment, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible supernatural romance stories. Your support means everything, and helps us continue creating these magical narratives. In the years that followed, Theron and Lyanna's reign became legendary. They ruled with wisdom and compassion, never forgetting the lessons learned from their ordeal. They established laws protecting Omegas from exploitation, created councils that gave voice to common wolves in matters of governance, and fostered alliances with neighboring packs based on mutual respect rather than dominance. The palace, once isolated and feared, became a place where any wolf could bring their grievances and expect fair hearing. Under their leadership, the kingdom flourished as never before. They had 3 children over the years, each born with unusual gifts that blended Theron's alpha power with something uniquely their own. Their eldest daughter could soothe any conflict with her presence, a living embodiment of the peace her parents had fought to create. Their son inherited his father's strength, but his mother's compassion, becoming a warrior who fought only to protect, never to conquer. Their youngest, a daughter with her mother's gentle heart and her father's fierce determination, would one day become an advisor to kings and queens across the continent, spreading the ideals her parents had championed. But despite the joy and success, neither Theron nor Lyanna ever forgot how close they had come to losing everything. On the anniversary of the night Lyanna had first embraced him during his transformation, they would climb to the highest tower of the palace and sit together in silence, watching the moon rise and remembering. They would hold each other close, grateful for every moment, knowing that their love had been tested in ways most could never imagine, and had emerged not just intact, but stronger for the trials endured. The story of the cursed Alpha King and the Omega who dared to embrace him became a tale told throughout the realm, passed down through generations. It became more than just a story about breaking curses or finding true love. It became a parable about the power of compassion in the face of fear, about choosing connection over isolation, about the strength that comes from allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Parents told it to their children to teach them that sometimes the most monstrous appearing beings need kindness most. That courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. That one person's choice to show love can ripple outward to change an entire world. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest magic of all, more powerful than any curse or counterspell. Two people, brought together by circumstance and fate, choosing to see each other truly and love what they saw despite all the reasons not to. Oh, Ting learning that strength sometimes means accepting help. And Omega, discovering that gentleness is its own form of power. Together, they proved that even the darkest curses could be broken, that even the deepest wounds could heal, and that love, when truly given and freely received, could transform not just individuals, but entire kingdoms. Their legacy lived on not in grand monuments or mighty conquests, but in the simple truth that everyone, even cursed kings and ordinary Omegas, deserves to be embraced exactly as they are,